umabot ng mahigit 606,000.
So when I was just starting with this videography and overall YouTube stuff, the most difficult thing for me is how to know if my exposure is correct, how to know if my image is exposed properly, and when to use an artificial light. So what is exposure? Exposure determines how light or dark your image will be, and this will greatly affect your color grading. It is also important to know what is the best settings for your camera. For example, for me, I'm using Sony a7 IV, so I use S-Log3 as my picture profile. It is a flat picture profile which you can color grade later in the post-production. The problem with S-Log3 is that it has a base ISO of 800, and usually if it's daytime and when I'm shooting outside, it is too bright, so I need an ND filter for that. And this one is from Freewell. This is their M2 magnetic filter system, which is a quick swap magnetic filters. It has ND8, ND64, ND1000, CPL, and a UV filter, and also a lens cap. So actually my camera settings is not that hard to understand, and it's just the same as everyone else. I shoot in 24 frames per second, so I follow 180-degree shutter rule. So my shutter speed is 1/50 always. And then if I need slow motion shots, I will switch to 60 frames per second, and my shutter speed is double that, which is 1/120. Then my aperture, I always set it to f4. I only shoot wide open during nighttime or if I need a lot of light. So assuming you know the exposure triangle for photography, it's like the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed forming a triangle because they are interconnected to each other. That will influence the brightness of your image. I always use the lowest ISO possible. For S-Log3, it's 800 as I mentioned, and then my shutter speed is always twice of my shooting frame rate, so it's 1/50, and then my aperture, I always stay at f4 unless I need more light for my sensor. So all of these three settings are already filled out, so it's easy to understand and to memorize. So with these settings, probably if you're shooting outside, your highlights or the whole image will be blown out because it is too bright. So every time I shoot outdoors, I will use ND64 at least. So the only time that I will use a lesser strong ND filter is when I'm in a shade like this. So it's too dark right now and I'm still on the minimum settings of ISO 800, f4, and 1/50. So now I will use ND8. This is how it looks like without a filter or ND filter. And then I will put the ND8 for this. Having a magnetic filter makes it easier for me to change ND filters. I can use as well and stack a CPL filter on top of the ND if you wanted to shoot a water surface and remove the glare from it. So if you can see the reflection of the sun, and then if I turn the CPL, it removes a lot of that glare that it reflects on the water surface. So when shooting outdoors, I always prioritize my highlights. So if there is a brighter part of the image and it gets blown out, I always compensate for that and try to save it because it looks awful and it looks unprofessional when you have blown out highlights, especially the sky. But then again, it still depends on you, especially if you need to prioritize the exposure of the subject. For example, when I'm shooting indoors and my shot includes the window, which will always be blown out if it's daytime. For that, I will compensate for the exposure of the subject. For my exposure, I use my monitor, the camera monitor with the exposure meter. If it's 2.0, I'm okay with it. And if the highlight looks okay on the monitor, and then I will proceed shooting with that kind of exposure. And then if it's blinking above 2.0, it means that I'm overexposed. So I usually will compensate with ND filter, stronger ND filter, and ACPL filter sometimes helps as well. And then sometimes I use external monitor on my phone. So I'm using the wireless monitor app, which is the Monitor Plus. I really like this app, especially in terms of checking the exposure, because you can put your own LUT to check your exposure or your color graded footage. And then it has also false color if you want to check your highlights, midtones, and shadows. And also you can check the histogram here if your image is overexposed or underexposed, and not just relying on your camera monitor to check the overall exposure of the shot. So yeah, again, this one is the Monitor Plus app that is compatible with Sony cameras. Indoor scenarios sometimes are more complicated than the outdoor ones because sometimes you need to use ND filters, sometimes you don't. And the first thing you need to do is to find the source of the light that you will be using for the shot. So for example, this one, I'm using the hard light coming through the window, and as you can see, I'm overexposed. And for this, I will use the ND64 for this, and this will make the shot more dramatic like that. As you can see, the highlights are exposed properly, but the shadow part is too dark. And sometimes that is the compromises that you will need to choose if you are in a situation where the image is too contrasty. Saving your highlight is much better than having a good balance of exposure to the whole image. So for this one, I save the highlights, but the consequence is I probably will crash the shadows already, but I think this will give you a dramatic look on your image, and I think it is still usable. So in order to improve this hard light to a softer light, I will use this 5-in-1 reflector to soften the light that is coming from the window. Oopsie. Like this. So now we have much softer and diffuse light coming from the window, but now the image is too dark because of our ND filter. So we'll just use the ND8 for that one. As you can see, the exposure is much better, and we're at 0.7 on the exposure meter, and I'm still using the f4 1/50 ISO 800 for the settings. Usually on an indoor scenario like this, I will always set my camera to the minimum settings, and then I will adjust with the source light that I will use. So the difference between the diffused one and this so big that you have to change ND filters for each kind of shot. So for this one, I'm using the ND64 again. And then when we put the diffuser back, I need to change to ND8 to have a better exposure. That's why I like this Freewell M2 magnetic filter system, because it's magnetic and it's easy to swap out ND filters and other filters if you need to use CPL or other stuff. So another example on how we can expose our image when shooting indoors is by using a large window again, but this time it has a softer light coming through it because the sunlight doesn't shine directly. With this kind of light, I think we can get away without using ND filter. And so let's try it and turn this camera on. So as you can see, I'm not using an ND filter, but the image is exposed properly. We are at 0.7 right now on the exposure meter, and I'm still using the minimum settings of f4, 1/50, and ISO 800. But the only difference with this shot is I set up a negative fill on my right side to get this kind of more dramatic shots and having that shadows on the right side of my face. So if I move closer to this negative fill, you can see that the shadow part is much darker than if I move here. Without changing the settings of my camera, I can manipulate the contrast of the image. And so that's how I expose my videos when I'm shooting indoors with just the natural light. But what if you want to include the window on the shot and it's overexposed? The first thing you need to do again is to expose for the highlights. We will put the ND64 for this. And now the highlights is exposed properly, but the problem is that we are underexposed. And I am almost gone in the dark and in the shadows. In this scenario, you need an artificial light. So we need to set up a light for this kind of shot to compensate for the highlights outside. So now I'm using the small rig RC100. It's a 100 watt light, and it's already set at 100% with a daylight 56K. So this is how it looks like with just the COB light at 100% intensity. This is a 100 watt light again, and with the diffuser and the light grid. And right now we are at 0.3. No, it's 0.0. But our goal is to expose the highlights outside. If I just move a little bit like this with the window on the background, as you can see, the highlights is not that blown out too much, but it's bright. And I'm already running the light 100%. So if I wanted to make my subject more brighter or the same with the highlights outside, I should use much bigger light or much powerful light than 100 watt. This is how you expose with a brighter image or a much contrasty shot. You have to compensate with an artificial light like this without changing your exposure in your camera settings. So this process of knowing how to expose our image, or how can we utilize lights like this, artificial lights for videos, and also how we can save our highlights or where to put our camera in terms of the lighting situation. We will save so much time in color grading and in the post-process, in post-production, and probably will save us from reshooting or retaking the whole scene or the whole sequence because of we messed the exposure. And so I think that's it for this video, and I hope you got something from this video, and if you do, please like, comment, and subscribe. Until then, I will see you again next time. Bye.